My name is Steve Spellman. I'm the president of the board of the World Affairs Council. I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and I'd like to thank you all for having your vaccination cards with you, as we have people, including me, who like to be around vaccinated people. I want to thank our instant issue sponsors, which are Wilbraham and Munson Academy, Glen Meadow, and Sir Speedy. Also, a special thanks to NAI Plotkin, which allows us to meet in this beautiful room and to have our offices here in this very convenient building. I'd like to thank our board member over here, Jeremy Cole of JV Cole TV, and Jeff Krasner, who are over here, along with Mike Sweeney, who are live streaming this so that people can watch it online. We'd also like to thank our strategic partners, Valley Eye Radio, who are making an audio of this available for people who either can't come or can't watch the program. Our next program is May 18th. It won't be here. It'll be in the evening at Valley Venture Mentors on Bridge Street. And it's going to be a very special program. It's going to be moderated by our longtime friend of the council, Diane Doherty. And it will be a panel discussion on Friends from Afghanistan, the refugee experience in Western Massachusetts. So I think that's going to be a terrific program. And again, it's coming out May 18th. And the great Sid Melcher will make sure that you get plenty of notices on that. We'll be offering a light halal supper before that. So come for the fellowship and kind of getting to know each other. And if you haven't had that kind of food, I can assure you it's delicious. Most of the people here are members. If you're not a member, please join. Members, if you've got a friend or somebody that you're talking to about and say, my God, I went to this great program, encourage them to join. There will be a question period. I encourage you from the bottom of my heart for all of us, if you have a question for the speaker at the end of her presentation, please start it with the words, one of these words, who, what, when, where, how, please explain, please describe, rather than the word I. Tend to keep things shorter and more interesting. Our speaker today will be introduced by Ellen Morehouse, who's a longtime friend of the council, who currently serves as the communications director at the Women's Funding Network. Ms. Morehouse.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So, hi, yes, thank you. I'm Ellen Morehouse, comms director for Women's Funding Network, but I'm here today in a unique capacity because Dr. Laura Reed was actually one of my professors back at UMass, and I think still to this day, the reason why I'm in politics or work in this industry. So I think there's a lot that we can get by when we just read someone's bio, but I'd love to add a little bit more color to it, that the woman behind the knowledge, the woman behind the science, and a lifetime career actually has longer ramifications across the rest of us, right? And how we carry that work forward. I don't tend to think that we live single-issue lives. All of the intersecting facets of our lives, from our education to our professional experience, really color the perspective that we bring to the world. So I am here to read her bio and introduce this fabulous woman, but I would be remiss if I didn't say what a big impact she had on me and my life and my professional work that continues to this day. So thank you. And she just told me she's doing the honors thesis, a bio. We'll get to this. We'll let her do her own, but there's more than just this bio. So welcome Dr. Reed today, who is a lecturer at the Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, my alma mater. She served as assistant director of the 5-college program in Peace and World Security Studies, a fellow in the Managing the Atom program at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and as a research scientist in MIT's Security Studies program. Her research interests include U.S. national security policy, implications of globalization for peace and security, nuclear security, nonproliferation, disarmament initiatives, and emerging norms of humanitarian intervention and collective responses to transnational problems. I can't think of anyone more worthy to speak to us on these issues today. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, well, thank you so much. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here in person. This is an issue that I care about deeply, but more importantly, after almost 2 years of Zoom interactions, from the chest up, I am so pleased to have an in-person event. And with that in mind, because this is the first live in-person event. I have prepared lots and lots I can talk about, but what I would like to do is really keep myself, because this is such a expansive topic, there are a lot of ways I could go, but I would like to really make sure that we have a conversation. So I will be really good about stopping early. I can pick up with more details. But what I think will be most beneficial is I'll lay certain beginning talking points as I have been shocked, riveted, and glued to the news over these past 2 months, trying to make sense of unfolding events and worrying very profoundly of what lies ahead. But at the same time, I would like to take this as an opportunity for each of us to share and to question what we are hearing and thinking about. So what I first want to do is, you've got the bio introduction, but I think it's important to also start that I have to come clean. I am a child of the Cold War. I grew up in a time when the Cold War tensions were raging. I was one of those people in kindergarten that actually did duck and cover with no explanation as to what we were supposed to do. At the same time, I ultimately chose, after college, to pursue the field of international security from the agenda of feeling that it had gotten so alarmingly offensive, dangerous, such enormous resources, that I was very interested in trying to devote as much time to efforts to go step by step to reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons and to inform the public. So from the 1980s to today, and I just added it up, it's 40 years, I have interplayed mostly research, writing. At times I worked with nonprofits, and now since 2006, I've had the privilege of teaching at UMass Amherst, working with undergraduates and graduates, addressing some of these challenges. And the one thing I can say is, the longer I am doing this, the more humility I feel. With all my great political science theories and data and all these things don't always work out the way you anticipate. So with that in mind, I want to say there's no way I have a crystal ball in terms of what we're all thinking about what lies ahead. But I do feel that it's important for us to take a moment right now to kind of look over, and my talk will be divided into sort of 3 parts. Suddenly, there's always a worry about World War III and conflicts escalating. But there is no question that these last few months, the activities, the violent attack, the escalated rhetoric and actions have raised the specter of a possible escalation of the current war in Ukraine to fears about possibly it escalating to a World War III. And so that's now suddenly on the radar. We political scientists talk about this in terms of focusing events. Something that's been long-standing, ongoing, suddenly you have a crisis, something unexpected that just shifts the course of debate. And we have sort of a turning point in terms of what lies ahead, who's paying attention to it, what the possibilities are for action, and the risks, of course. But with that in mind, I think what you see is we are all completely riveted by this sense of the urgency of now, of events in Ukraine, standing up to Russia's aggressive, trying to support the allies, the work of NATO, and all these other developments unfolding day by day. There is this remarkable, we are in literally a fog of war and crisis decision-making. So on the one hand, I want to, and I'm happy to talk to you about the various threads that are important to be paying attention in terms of on the ground what's happening in Europe, especially with respect to nuclear threats, the policies, and what can be done about it. But at the same time, what I feel most comfortable and what I will really want to jump into for the second half of my talk is to help us bring back home. We are indeed at a turning point period. And with that, with this crisis, there is a window of opportunity to address what are some enormously important threats to our security in the medium and long term. And that's where I want to really focus on some important issues in terms of nuclear weapons, nuclear modernization, the security structure that now exists that need to be questioned and reformed and changed at a moment when we have an unprecedented sense of unity among the NATO allies, at least, and in governments in terms of the response. And just as at the end of World War II, when we were in the throes of the most desperate fighting and challenges and fears, that was the key moment to plan for the peace. And that was the moment that, with the Dumbarton Oaks Declaration, worked behind the scenes to come up with what ultimately was the United Nations and other things of the post-war world. I want to just say what I think is important as we're thinking about avoiding World War III and nuclear threats is, yes, it's a game changer right now. Putin's actions, his threats, his policies, and this very real question about what we do with this pariah state right now and how to respond. We also could think about it in terms of ultimately the desire is to get a negotiated settlement, a stable peace that will make all secure in a way that we don't have a replay of past conflicts and wars. So what I wanted to say, so let's just briefly get right into it. In terms of Ukraine, I am, wholeheartedly supportive of both the NATO policy, fully sanctioning and organizing in terms of the response, what is right now an absolutely inexcusable, aggressive, interstate act of aggression. So, in terms of where I'm coming from, I am by no means an apologist for Russia. And as I have been trying to read through different sources, I have been actually quite quiet on Twitter because I felt like I really needed to get more information before I just did that retweet and snarky comments, because it has been very alarming and confusing, a lot of the distortions, misinformation, and trending things in terms of trying to get a good picture of what's been happening. But nonetheless, we do have a situation where, as I'm sure this is part of the reason why you came today, there has been a brinkmanship of not just heightened rhetoric threatening escalation to a possible nuclear war, but also changed alert rates on the part of Russia's military forces, training exercises, and not too veiled threats that if certain actions are taken, Russia will respond in kind with possible nuclear chemical strike. So this is where we are today. At the same time, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but here in the United States, and not too far back in the previous administration, we had a president that was fond of Twitter. And at the height of tensions with North Korea, former President Trump also said very alarming, threatening things of brinkmanship with respect to actions that might be taken by the United States if North Korea acted. So what we have right now is a situation where the key nuclear-armed nations have sole authority to use nuclear weapons. And on the part of the United States, obviously you know that the president is commander-in-chief's sole authority. And the launch codes, those top secret launch codes, are at most the length of a Twitter feed. So in that amount of time, we have in existence launch on warning, launch within minutes on the part of both sides. And so right now, that hasn't changed. And this is the thing that's important to remember, that actually none of these realities have changed that much on the part of US and Russia. At the other hand, though, what you see is that we are in a conflict where rhetorical training doctrines that are stated have very different meaning when you are seeing the scorched earth policies of the Russian government, of the use of various types of, from cluster munitions on out, things that are indiscriminately affecting populations. And right now, as we probably you've heard, we're now in a moment of intensified attacks and warfare in these next few weeks. So it's very scary at this moment. The war is raging. I don't know if you remember back, one of the things that really caught my attention the first day of war was when Russian tanks rolled through Chernobyl. And the site of a former nuclear reactor that was the instance of one of the worst nuclear accidents. and then it went down silent. And the reporting that is usually given from the reactor to central authorities that help to make sure everything's okay, the power's on, there isn't any change, stopped. And that was just at the beginning. And if you look at the Intergovernmental Authority, this is to remind me so I don't talk too long. The Intergovernmental Authority, the IAEA, what happened was they started seeing elevated radiological numbers on the site. And this was the only information we had. We heard that the regular skeleton crew had been held hostage, that unidentified forces was there, there were skirmishes, and all we had was this information. So ultimately, we are in a situation where from the very beginning, there was radiological ramifications in this conflict that raised alarm bells. And in subsequent weeks, with some of the fights near current nuclear power plants in Ukraine, there was times when the power was cut off, all these different things. So there's no question that from the very beginning, this nuclear threat, the radiological threat, was there. Now, to go back to what now the IAEA now thinks, the reason that there were elevated rates at Chernobyl, they think, was because the Russian tanks raised the soil, and there's a lot of driving around going through in their advance to the outskirts of Kyiv, and that because the dust, that helped to loosen what had been radioactive materials that had been kind of stuck in the soil. So that's now the current understanding of this. But people were very alarmed from the outset of what was going on. So from the beginning of this conflict, there has been this sense of urgency of the potential to escalate, to have devastating impact beyond the territory of Ukraine. So there is no question that there are so many risks, there's so much that is going on that we can get into in terms of the conduct of the war and how it might play out. But what I wanted to talk about is then we had this, again, very surprising unified response on the part of NATO, on the part of so many countries. And we are at a moment where there has been a rallying. Of course, the Ukrainians have been tremendously committed defenders and have been fighting. At the same time, they have a leader that has just catalyzed the international community with his charismatic and moving speeches on behalf of the Ukrainians. And as he said this past week, we are kind of at this moment where nobody really expected that Ukraine would be able to stand up to the vastly superior Russian military forces. And there has been this sense of, well, we have a window of opportunity right now. And for some, there has been a sense of, oh, well, maybe this will be able to stay under control, or maybe it won't. And so we have the obvious scenarios of people worry that with the situation that's been happening in Russia, there have been explicit threats that if either certain powers, if certain arms are transferred, if certain commitments are made, Russia would not, would have no compunction but to consider using a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon, and they certainly have those that are documented. At the same time, there is a sense of, well, wait a minute. NATO, President Biden have shown restraint. There are clear statements that are saying there's no intention on the part of the US and NATO to get involved directly in this war. So there's sort of a sense of, well, this is absolutely very alarming. It's totally changed the security architecture of Europe. But at the same time, maybe we might be able to have it contain it in terms of its conventional nature. So that's where we are today. But there's no question that the events in Ukraine have created a total turning point change. I mean, to go within 2 months of seeing what's happened with Germany's military spending and shift all over the sanctions, 5 rounds of sanctions, nobody would have expected the way things have changed in such a short amount of time. It's absolutely critical to appreciate that. At the same time, we have this question of going forward. What are Russia's aims? How is it going to play out in Ukraine? How can the international community, NATO especially, respond? How can citizens respond? And so what you see is there are people that are thinking about this, and this is why I'm talking about going back in time. I did my PhD thesis looking at efforts to achieve collective security at the end of World War II. Because along with this enormous crisis, this very scary moment, there is also a possibility to reform, to change, and to finally try to prevent this through changes in the United Nations, multilateral organizations, in military policies and postures, so that we can prevent this replay of escalating to possible World War III. So we now are sitting here today in the midst of a war. I have no special insights except that I have been following the news very closely. But what I think you see is that there have been a series of conflicts. This is the biggest, most unprecedented interstate conflict since the end of the Cold War. And it falls on the heels of a prior commitment that was made to Ukraine when it first gave up its nuclear weapons, returned them to Russia, that there would not be, this was called the Budapest Memorandum, that there was a commitment that states and Russia and the United States and NATO would honor the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And that has clearly been violated. There are any number of these agreements with the annexation of Crimea by Russia on out, where Ukraine has been threatened. And obviously, it's a very complicated story. I'm not saying there aren't two sides and a lot going on, but it's pretty clear right now that the security architecture is broken in terms of protecting the peace and security of nations, and especially I'm focused on Europe in this case. So we have a problem where everyone is aware of that shortcoming. In the first days, the UN Security Council tried to hold a vote. Russia vetoed it. You couldn't even get any type of censure. More recently, you did eventually get an agreement that kicked off Russia from the Human Rights Council through the General Assembly. But in terms of really having the type of direct, immediate response, which NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, first was founded on, of an attack against one is an attack against all, and this commitment that if a country is attacked, that the other members would come to protect them and respond. Ukraine, of course, is not a member of NATO. That's the longer piece of what has been at play. But back to what I wanted to really focus on is we have this heightened conflict. Things are changing day by day. There is a very real fear that in this fog of war intentions, that it could spill over to a NATO member, or that the Putin regime might explicitly escalate by either doing a symbolic trial nuclear explosion or actually using a nuclear weapon. And this is what has had both at NATO headquarters and the Bush administration, people sort of going through, they call them tiger teams, trying to figure out, oh my goodness, how would we respond? So what I first want to say is, as scary as it seems and as alarmed as we all should be, when you really sit down and consider the options, what you find is that this so-called status quo of these enormous stockpiles and nuclear weapons and standing on either side, that the basic calculus of risk and advantage has not changed. And right now, you know, most people are saying, as surprising as it is, it's still pretty stable in terms of this issue of escalating to use a nuclear weapon. The big catch is, as long as NATO does not get involved directly in the conflict, and then things would change. But if we do continue along this course where NATO and the United States very clearly said they're staying out of it, of directly fighting Russia, in theory, you know, if you think through what are the possibilities and risks, most people say, look where the tactical nuclear weapon or any weapon would be used, it's right on Russia's doorstep, right in their neighborhood. And what military utility would that have? They would then have to follow up. If they are trying to kind of control territory on out, it will create a real mess that would not have anything that they couldn't achieve through this current sort of strategy that they're employing of these scorched earth conventional weapons. So as much as this doesn't sound appealing, there is a sense that this so-called MAD or deterrence theory might be holding in current circumstances. But that's not to say that we shouldn't worry about what's happening with Washington and Moscow. And this is the key thing of showing restraint. And that can change at any moment, as we've seen. But what I want to just spend the next few minutes, I'm trying to see how much time I have. Oh, pretty good. OK. sort of talking about is, so we're shifting, we're looking at the urgency of now. I can go through in Q&A in terms of walking through what is now being discussed as possible diplomatic and military off-ramps to try to resolve this ongoing war as we think it through. The piece that is important to remember is we sort of have this hot war of a conflict. It will then, we hope, but move to a period of either a ceasefire or some negotiation that will then drag on for years and years and years. And as we've seen in other conflict zones, that is where it will be very important, but people will over time stop paying attention. So what I'm trying to say right now is, while we are at this moment, yes, there's so much urgency in terms of supporting Ukraine, pushing forward with agreements to try to stop Russia from continuing with its wars, trying to give some type of off-ramp for them. At the same time, what's important for us is to consider the larger, if we really are concerned about avoiding World War III, how we deal with the threat of nuclear weapons in Europe and throughout the world. And with that in mind, what I wanted to really spend the last few minutes talking to you about is that we have heightened concern, but we don't have heightened attention being paid. And let me just ask, how many of you are familiar with the fact that the United States is now in the midst of a nuclear posture review? It was just presented to Congress in a classified briefing. And this is a periodic review of the posture of U.S. nuclear forces, modernization, and strategy. Has anyone? Yes, excellent. Well, this is something that, again, this is where, as a U.S. citizen, people that are informed and concerned, this is something that is very important to think about and to be involved in and aware of. And what we are finding is that currently the United States is just engaging in a continued, what I call status quo, of enormously high levels of spending on nuclear forces and this very ambitious modernization program, which is being codified and upheld by this posture review in terms of the reliance of what types of nuclear forces, the numbers and levels and rationale, and importantly, this first use policy that we have as a part of our doctrine. And so this is the type of thing that I think is important for us to be thinking about, and more importantly, getting into a discussion of the NATO alliance. The US is the only, well, actually, UK and France do possess nuclear weapons, but under this defense alliance, this military structure, it relies very explicitly on nuclear weapons in fighting and waging war. And so this is a key piece of the doctrines and piece of NATO, and it's very interwoven with advanced conventional aircraft and other things with the possibility of being nuclear capable. And this is the piece that doesn't usually get a lot of attention, but Russia has certainly paid attention to and is concerned with. And again, not to justify Russia's actions, but it's this dual use dimension that in the fog of war with suspicions and hostilities that creates threats of escalation and going from a possibility of a conflict to a catastrophic conflagration. So that's the worry in terms of thinking about escalate to de-escalate. You've heard a lot about this in terms of the conduct of the war in Ukraine. At the same time, it's important for us to reflect upon our doctrines and framework for security. And what I'm suggesting is that now is the time in this rare moment when we do have unity and shared commitment on the part of NATO members to really try to rethink and work on that and address these issues, because in the longer term, that will be crucial for the security of Europe. So again, I want to get into much more discussion in terms of the invasion, the weaknesses and shortcomings of the United Nations and other structures in trying to first deal with that and different possibilities. But what I really wanted to highlight to you is we are at a moment in the 21st century where we need to reform and to fundamentally change the international security structures that were created and codified at the end of World War II. And what we are seeing now is people talk about this as bend or break. So the question is, are we at a moment where we are going to have a total breakdown of the post-World War II and then transition to the post-Cold War period of the type of relative peace that we have seen to a very different era? And when you're looking at different countries that are either thinking of getting nuclear weapons or possess nuclear weapons. We are at this very dangerous moment of a possible spiraling new arms race of not just with the existing nuclear weapon states, but with other that are very close or might be motivated in the context of these rising tensions. So this is something that I think is really important for us to think about. So my basic intention is, if you're looking at all the data, how things are happening, despite this sense of fear and panic, like, oh, let's just buy more, get additional versions. If you look at the nuclear arsenals that are in possession, the command and control, all of that, what you see is there are much greater worries about the threat that it poses of either inadvertent or escalatory measures. And so with that in mind, it's really important to think about what we can do here in the United States. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes to say, okay, we have this crisis, we have all these things going on, and then what's important? And what's important right now is very clearly showing and stating and acting upon a commitment on the part of the United States that, yes, the United States will respond to aggression and conflict, but to reiterate this no first use commitment. And that is something, because it is, if you are looking at B-52s that are making runs nearby and other things that are dual capable, there is a concern that there is a whole ladder of escalation that might happen. So what you see is that Russia right now, as most people have sort of argued in looking at the behavior of Putin and the regime, reprehensible, opportunistic, aggressive. You have seen so many broken promises of agreements on out. But if you really think about it in the mindset of the Putin clique, I would say, they are pursuing military adventurism. And the question is, why would they risk all-out confrontation with a technologically advanced nuclear-armed adversary? And so right now, you can feel that, you know, all the things you say about Putin and Russia, it's not suicidal. It's very clear that there's absolutely this existential threat. At the same time, what you see is we have associated risks that we're all feeling, both on the part of the Putin regime and the United States. And this is, again, remembering that in the United States, sole authority to launch a nuclear attack is in the hands of the president. And that is something that it's possible to modify this process. This is not saying that you would somehow tie the hand of the president or slow down the process, but it's creating safeguards for the possible future president. And there were concerns with the past president in terms of stability and recklessness and fears about, you know, what it meant when you had inflammatory statements about how you might create a process of decision-making. And here we have like the Federal Emergency Management Agency that tracks officials in the presidential line of succession. We have all these ways where we can address this to tackle the dangers and risks of sole authority in the United States. And this is in part both we as citizens and also when you're in a crisis and a conflict situation right now with Russia, you know, how we can have that type of a guardrail that can help things. Secondly, I think you can see that there is this very ambitious and expensive program underway to modernize existing ICBMs. And in fact, there have been any number of analyses that have shown we can extend the lifetime of the ones that are there. There are all these other ways. And given all the economic upheaval and costs with the COVID pandemic and other demands on our society, do we really want to spend all that money? And if you look at key recommendations by people in the weapons labs on out, it's not essential. And it's seen more as being symbolic and keeping up with recent advances on the part of China and other countries. So it's something that, again, is sort of a political decision rather than something that's required for actual military security. So I just want to make sure, I promised I wouldn't talk for too long, but what I was trying to say is, and I'm hoping in question and answer I can get into running through the different scenarios in Ukraine, NATO, all these other things, whatever people are interested in, but also to keep front and center, now is the moment to think any conflict eventually requires a final settlement, a peace, a structure, and keeping our eyes on the prize of we want a stable, secure peace, preventing a replay of what happens in this terrible set of circumstances that have developed in Ukraine, and trying to create the rules the institutions and the actual verification measures, which we have those capabilities to do, that will actually make sure that we can document, we can truly deter, and that we can possibly prevent any further outbreaks and escalations to World War III. So I have so much more I'm happy to go to, but I want to stop now and open it up to questions.
NATO has said from the beginning that they don't want to get involved in Ukraine, at least in terms of putting troops on the ground. But as the war or the conflict, the invasion has gone on, we're going into the second month. NATO and the U.S. are providing more and more advanced weaponry to the Ukraine. Air defense, Harpoon, anti-ship missiles, tanks, helicopters, the list goes on. And with Putin looking at this as a form of indirect involvement on the part of NATO in the U.S. And he's warned that he will, if necessary, forced in a corner, use at least tactical nuclear weapons. Is NATO and the U.S., as they provide more weaponry, kind of pushing pushing Russia into eventually being forced to use nuclear weapons, even tactical?
That's an excellent question. So the question is, given that the United States and NATO are providing wide-ranging military, technical, economic relief, taking in, supporting direct investment, and very importantly, in terms of its unified response, absolutely Putin sees this as even more of a threat when you have Sweden and Finland saying, oh, we're now thinking of moving ahead and joining NATO. I mean, each of these is countering what was the stated concern and security grievance on the part of Putin, which was that the NATO military alliance was coming to the borders and threatening Russia in their own backyard. What I would say to you is right now, it's this key piece that there's so much military signaling and issues on the ground as it has unveiled. NATO is, in fact, and we see this in past conflicts where there is like more and more support, advanced weaponry. It has gone into the theater, and the question is, what do we say is the threshold for direct involvement? Is it through a third-party country? Is it on the border that's then transported by Ukraine? Right now, Ukrainian operators are being trained here in the United States. We do those types of training programs for all various militaries at times, yet that is absolutely aiding in a direct way in terms of if you're looking at anti-missile advanced weaponry and things like that. So that is a big concern. At the beginning of the conflict, there was a hotline that was put in place between the United States and Russia. And so I don't know if you know this, but President Biden tried to say that. At the same time, the NATO forces have also been trying to kind of keep these channels open in terms of these communications. And so they've walked a very fine line. But there's no question, as the conflict goes on, and especially with the graphic and horrifying images of, in Bucha and other places, atrocities, human rights abuses, scorched earth type possibilities, and very clearly, as much as all of us didn't believe for a minute Russia's rationale, but when you see in this next stage that the so-called Donbass areas where they were ostensibly trying to protect their Russian-speaking brethren, in terms of what we are now seeing of already the bombings and the preparations for invasion, it's very clear that Russia is both ignoring and is taking a very hard-lined and dangerous. And so the question is, Russia regrouped, brought in a new leader, is going for a whole another push. And I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but people have been talking about this kind of upcoming kind of timeline, as you think about it, of May 9th, the annual Victory Day for Russia. And some of the people that are really deep and knowledgeable about these types of things think Putin wants to have some type of a military, something that can be touted at this celebration. So people have been very nervous, but what's going to happen, escalation between now and then. as a way of kind of having something to croon about to your domestic audience. So there's very much a concern in the next 2-week period of what will happen, and as you're suggesting, where very clearly you have the arrival of more military personnel and support that is coming from NATO, and with the impact of the financial sanctions and now the second stage of stopping oil deliveries in the longer term. We'll see what happens with that. But there's no question that this is where people who are looking at this, and this is where, I don't know if you followed Zelensky, he gave a very moving interview that's published last week in The Atlantic, and was really saying, you know, right now there is a moment of truth, but they are fighting for their survival. And that there is a very real question right now in terms of what will happen over time. But it's pretty clear that Ukraine is not going to surrender, given what's happened over this past month, and that even if Russia is successful in taking control of these lands, you're going to have a very prolonged and bloody insurgency and very, very expensive and consuming occupation. So Russia, no matter what it is thinking, it's not like they can cut and run and leave and claim victory. So going back to your question about the dangers of nuclear escalation, that is where people are watching. So if you're concerned that Russia will do it, they can easily do it. And so that's something that, and it's important for you all to know, we have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has 330 monitoring stations that would, in a flash, immediately, you wouldn't have to rely on any military satellites or commercial satellites. It will be telegraphed, and we will get that information. So there's no way that Russia could deny or other things like that. So I'm not saying it could prevent it, but that is one piece of the structure that we have in place. The United States has not yet ratified that treaty, which commits nuclear weapon states not to test for a variety of reasons that have to do with the Republican Congress. But that is sort of one piece in place. You also have other features like that, that at least we can document it. And then this, going back to, and I want other people, does anyone else want to talk about what they think in terms of NATO and the likelihood of, with their increased involvement, that that will push Russia? Yeah.
It's not that question, but what I find most concerning is the fact that the press lockdown in Russia has been so successful that the Russian people have no idea what's going on in Ukraine, and that 80% of the Russians are apparently rallying around the flag and are supportive of Putin. And I find that to be the most scary.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so this is where this has been absolutely Russia, and it's been over the course of many years in terms of the way in which they have imposed censorship, have kicked out independent media or imprisoned. So they're, and with these latest laws that are actually cracking down on anything that's not patriotic information, you're absolutely right. And it is, again, very different. So when I talked to you about going back to earlier examples, this is a whole new world in terms of the distortion and misuse of social media and other things like that. At the same time, and what you've seen historically is Russians traditionally look after the Crimean War, other conflicts. You've had that same, and not just Russia, other countries, a short-term rally around whatever it is in the face of an outer force. What's people are thinking, though, is with Russia, people are seeing it immediately, from not being able to use your iPhone to scan to get for transit in Moscow, from things being removed from the stores. And so there is clearly a growing awareness of the important ramifications. So the question is, it is really alarming in terms of how successful Russia has been at, for the majority of the public, not letting them see anything except on state media and the key vetted accounts. Yet even still, you do see young Russians, others are moving with their feet, some have left, and some have been able to use VPN networks to get the information. There's all this cat and mouse stuff that's going on within Russia, but there's no question what you're saying is important, because Putin, there's no reason right now. The only thing that people who look at this are either his inner circle of either the military command or the security forces, whether they would kind of rally around. It was not, nobody's thinking that it'll be kind of in response to public protest or opposition with this regime. So you're right to highlight that as a concern. And also, again, if you broaden what I'm looking at in terms of escalation and preventing World War III, you don't just look in Europe in terms of the theater where we have tensions. You also see what's happening with China and in Asia in terms of what's happening in that region. And just by way of a aside, this is what people worry about, that something else is happening. A lot of people that were following this were saying, uh-oh, we were worried that either North Korea or somewhere else, they might be emboldened to do a nuclear test because everyone's preoccupied with what's happening in Europe. And even just in the news, with the time change in Taiwan, one of the public TV stations ran a banner, and it was Chiu Lik-kai saying that China has invaded. And it was, in fact, what turned out was they do these training things of emergency forces, fire and command, and somebody who was working in the station put in that banner plug in the morning news. And we'll hear the full story about what was going on, but I can tell you, China, the country, was not happy with it, and there are all these other tensions when you have such a state and this issue of control of media and information and how it plays out. Things are happening very quickly in the 21st century where these things can go viral and get out of control, and misinformation or false information is something that is a key concern, even more so than in past eras. So, I mean, you're highlighting a good concern, I mean, an important concern. Oh, wait, I have any, you don't have to gender identify, but any women want to say anything? Ask a question. I have a equal, I'm waiting. Yes.
You've convinced me that nuclear proliferation is not in the best interest, right? Mutual assured destruction, I think, is like something we're all around. What, in your point, would be your threshold of fear? What makes you afraid of, like, someone, if we give too much supplies, what would cross the line for you?
Okay, so that is absolutely, and again, no disrespect intended, but there's a reason why Ukraine hasn't been able to get acceptance and follow the rules to get joined into NATO. So Ukraine is a frail democracy, and there's been a lot going on in terms of issues of corruption and concern within Ukraine. So that's, and you have very different subgroups and very volatile politics within that country, apart from when you're faced with this total threat to the survival of your nation. So in terms of Ukraine itself, you have concerns about, you know, what happens if there is the current government, Zelensky, either gets killed or removed, and other, you have kind of a transition. What will happen, you know, and you're thinking 5 years on, and how that plays out with its neighbors, with other conflicts and tensions in the region. That's one thing, the perennial term of blowback. And the United States has had all too much experience with this, with Iraq and Afghanistan and any number of other past conflicts where very state-of-the-art types of weapon systems have been shared and then gone into other hands. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is, in terms of thinking about this with Russia, Russia has, it's totally shifted from the Cold War, whereas during the Cold War and the immediate aftermath, Russia was the country that had the largest conventional forces, heavy military, and the whole thing of the tripwire, what NATO was first established to prevent was NATO was threatening a nuclear escalation to prevent the tanks from rolling in and an invasion by better armed and equipped Russian. But now Russia sees that it's at a disadvantage. And so now it's reversed. And this is why you see Russia is making these explicit, both in training and in posture and in threats, saying that they will go nuclear in the face of any type of involvement by NATO, because they recognize that NATO is better armed and forced. So it's really changed in that way. So in terms of the utility of nuclear force or nuclear threats, we have had this nuclear taboo in place in terms of, apart from the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan since the end of World War II, no country has used nuclear weapons. There have been tests, of course, and there are, you know, in terms of the legacy, a lot of health and environmental effects that we need to acknowledge. But in that case, we haven't had the mass proliferation. And that's, I would argue, because there's limited utility. And as long, for example, with NATO, there are any number of countries there that are technologically, in terms of the economic sophistication of their industry, that could develop a nuclear weapon, but they've opted that it's not in their interest, that they can rely on this so-called nuclear umbrella on the part of the United States that will prevent any possible benefits. So the more serious problem, which has kind of gone into the further background, is either terrorist, illicit types of transfers. And that's where you get into more of these scenarios and concerns. But I think you're talking about conventional weaponry. And yeah, well, so I mean, but that's where, again, the United States is more vulnerable than anyone. If you look at our aircraft carriers, our conventional forces, to any type of advanced, anti-ship, and all these types of things that are moving around, that's where you have really big concerns of vulnerabilities in terms of the way things are. So there's very much in our interest to reduce this reliance, to create these restrictions, to not have this proliferation and spread, even though in the short term there's a sense of, give them everything that they might need and use. There are, and based on many, many examples of conflicts and proxy wars that have played out where the weapons went into other hands over time, that actually reduced people's security and continued bloodshed and instability. Sorry, yes.
I guess you're not quite gender neutral.
I'm doing 2 and 2. I'm going to do 2 and 2. I'm going to shake it up.
You talked a little bit about the political unrest in Ukraine prior to this happening.
Yeah.
And, Zelensky clearly has been very successful in garnering support internationally. Does he retain that support? We don't see anything about his not having that same support with other divisions of government within Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do you know more about that at all?
Oh, okay. Public dissatisfaction with Zelensky in the run-up. He was very unpopular. He wasn't able to, he had made these very bold promises that he hadn't been able to successfully carry through. There was inflation. There were all these problems of accusations of continuing corruption. So there was much higher criticism. And you think that popularity with Putin, he has totally rallied the Ukrainian people during this crisis where he has just been able to, who knows what way you can ever get a really accurate count of public opinion right now. But there's no question that if you're looking at the Ukrainian response and the way in which, just the way in which both the horrific refugee flows out, but then all the men that have come back to fight, and the way in which the level of support for the cause, and the way in which they've been able to coordinate under very, very adverse, hostile circumstances. Right now, people are saying that Zelensky is kind of the archetypical wartime leader. So again, this is where, depending on how you think about how long this conflict plays out, and one can only hope that within the next few months, we'll be able to achieve at least a ceasefire. We couldn't even get this for the evacuation on the part of the Red Cross, these humanitarian initiatives. But I think that will happen. And because all of my most hard-headed colleagues who have been studying the Russian military, their logistics, their command, all these different things, are saying that they've already been bled. They have had to reorganize. It's incredibly costly, the logistics of trying to maintain this force. The pressures on Russia as this thing plays out for a really long time will be much harder in terms of their military command to be able to sustain the level of mobilization that they are now undertaking. So it just depends in terms of Zelensky in Ukraine in the next year to 3 years, what's going to happen. And that's where it just all depends whether or not the current government, Zelensky and his party, are able to stay in power, or we don't know what happens if there is a violent overthrow, a coup. Russia's plan had been, ostensibly what we think, was to put in somebody who was totally supportive and more pliant and a puppet in terms of in the aftermath. But right now, given the response of NATO and other countries, I don't see that happening unless something unexpected. It's very unlikely right now. And Putin has not made, of course he has this wonderful relationship with China on out, but there hasn't been, in terms of what China has been doing and signaling, I don't think there's going to be any way that it's going to be able to get the level of support that will be needed to sustain this level of military aggression, the cost of it. But it's really, that's another one of these, it's been really remarkable. And I turn to my colleagues who are much more expert on the Ukrainian and Russian, those internal concerns to really, but I've been, based on my knowledge. Now, okay. And we had some very, yes, you were very nicely. Yeah.
How do you see the intersection of politics and security, where politics change and security arrangements tend to be fixed, especially in trying to change and create a new system of security?
Excellent question. So you're asking such a good question of the interplay of politics and security and the structures in place. So by saying that, on the one hand, in terms of politics, you're assuming, I think, that you're able to keep either the system of government from a democracy, from an autocracy, from a, whatever is happening in Russia, those types of political systems, and then you're talking about either the domestic politics or the key leadership within it, different issues of do you support, do you not support, changes over time. Is that what you're trying to identify?
Yes.
And that's what you're saying can change. Because what I would argue, and we are very lucky here in the United States as one of the oldest continuous democracies. Democracies are incredibly fragile. And so the real fear is with our politics that it's based on at least 80% on the legitimacy of the governed, of going along. And so the question is with politics, we have had this unhinging within our country in a way that has really rattled people that are studied democratic governance, and there are all these tests of like how strong or stable a democracy is. And the United States has been backsliding. So in terms of politics, it does change, and it can change. So you either have it in a so-called orderly way of through an election or through a change of government. That's one piece. Or you have it through a coup, an overthrow, or an invasion. So that's another piece. But in terms of what you're asking about the security structures, basically, this is where I didn't get into it as much as I would have liked to. But there are very rare moments when you have enormous game-changing events that are turning point periods, when you're talking about international security, and especially when you're thinking about geopolitics. And one of the concerns right now, it's like the rise and fall of great powers and these shifts over time. And oftentimes it's associated with either catastrophic economic or military conflicts as they change. So the thing about the security architecture that we have right now, and specifically if you're looking at the shift from the breakup of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, that whole block of countries it collapsed and shifted in a way that it's remarkable that the security transition that's happened over the last 30 years in this region has been as unviolent. Nobody really expected that. If you go back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, people were very afraid and worried about what would happen in the aftermath of that, of internal conflict. And what's remarkable is that it hasn't played out, but the problem is you have these old-time, this is where I have this, weapons of mass destruction, indiscriminate weapons, and these technologies that are in play that underpin doctrines on the part of our security regime. And one of them has been going back to the end of World War II, nuclear weapons, that they were kind of in a category apart. So if we're focusing just on the security that people think they can have from reliance on nuclear weapons, what I would suggest is if you think back to the formation of the United Nations, there was an initial intention and assumption that after things were filled out, that the United States would give up and renounce its nuclear weapons, and that it would be put under international control. Because nuclear weapons were seen, if you go through the calculus, the logic of all of these things, that, of course you can't, once the genie is out of the box, you can't do anything about that, but that you need to have some way of assuring that you didn't have the potential of one state or some states to threaten others. And so it's going back to that fundamental logic. People have forgotten about that. But growing out of early days of, it was called one world or none, and there was a very clear intention that there was recognition that you would never have a stable sense of security with nuclear weapons. and that you needed to come up with ways of reducing the incentives for either preventive or threatening attack on the part of a nuclear armed state in the face with other countries. So in terms of this longer term security piece, people have forgotten that in this is a turning point period. We're not turning back. The world is different. And so I'm not pretending I know how this will play out. But what I'm trying to suggest is that fundamental recognition that with these, and it's not just, it's cyber, it's all these other forces, digital, all these different things that are at play, disruptive technologies, that there's a need for a reformed, strengthened security architecture that's global, that's impartial, that's enforceable, if we hope to prevent another outbreak or even World War III.
On that note.
Cheerful note, cheerful note.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out again.